It is a pleasure for me to coordinate this table on underground space. It is made up by three parts. First of all, the keynote conference, then Francisco Schmidt and architect engineer Carlos Arroyo will give us their comments on underground space. Well, but to start with the session, I will give the floor to Admiral, who will, well, he was born in 1959 and he studied civil engineering and applied sciences in Rotterdam. He obtained a master's degree. He has worked for the Netherlands government, and in 2001 he was a director of the first excavated system in the Netherlands. Hans is executive director of COE, and he was in this position during 10 years. At the same time, he was the director of underground space in Wiesinger. In 2008, he founded Empowered Management Consultant in Holland, and he's a strategist and thought leader in underground space. In March 2018, he published his first book, written together with Antonia Coronado. He is president of Itacus, a committee specialized in underground spaces. As you can see, Admiral is a specialist in this topic. You have the floor and welcome him.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for
gracias.
I can hear the interpreter. No, I think I'm okay now. I hope you can all see my presentation okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for introducing me. Just a quick add-on from my side. As mentioned, I am co-chair of the ITA Committee on Underground Space together with Antonia Cornaro. We wrote a book on underground spaces, which I want to highly recommend to you. If you want more information on the book, you can get that from the website thinkdeep.net, and more on the work of Itacus can be found on the website of the ITA, the International Tunneling and Underground Space Association. So let's get to the core of what I want to talk to you about today. There are two key principles that will define the future of underground space use, at least in my opinion. And the first principle is the planning of underground spaces. That is certainly something that needs to be addressed. Up to now, in all the years that Itacus has been working, we have only found few examples worldwide of planning practice that actually incorporates the underground space. I'm happy to say this is beginning to become more and more part of the urban planning practice, but not at the rate where we would like to see it happening. I will go in my presentation into this key principle a bit more, and hope you will understand why we think this is a key principle. And it is something that is very necessary and needs to happen. The other principle is the multiple use of underground spaces. Again, something we will look into as we go through the presentation. A key principle, we have to stop using the underground for just one purpose. We have to start looking at how we can use our spaces for multiple purposes. But to begin with, let's look at the challenges that cities face nowadays. And I don't think this map is a surprise to you all. It's a map that shows the rapid urbanization and the population growth that we have to cope with on our planet. And these are the predictions for 2030, which is only 8 years away. And apart from the fact that we can see that about 60% of the world population will be living in cities by then, we can also see that 8.6% are predicted to be living in megacities, which are basically cities that house 10 million people or more inside their city limits. Of course, another big challenge is climate change. I think we are all aware of the fact that the climate is changing. A lot of people are not quite aware of these questions of 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees. There's even a reference from the World Bank, which has determined that there's no certainty that humans could adapt to a 4-degree world. I always try to see these figures as in relation to my own body temperature. I'm fine at the moment, but raise my body temperature by 2 degrees, I wouldn't be feeling all that fine. And if I raise it by 4 degrees, then I would feel very poorly indeed. And this is what we're looking at. This week, a report by the UN climate panel came out, which basically said we really have to start acting now. It's no longer time for discussions or research or whatever. We have to start acting now. Otherwise, we will move towards disastrous times. And of course, I think the subsurface underground spaces have a large role to play in climate change as well. When it comes to urban areas, we all know that one of the things that we have to cope with in terms of climate change is, of course, the urban heat island effect. You can see in this diagram that when we talk about downtown areas where we have a lot of concrete buildings, a lot of steel buildings, asphalt pavements, little green, then the heat is actually absorbed by the city. It's retained by the city, which on average makes the city a lot hotter than the surrounding rural areas. We can also see that city parks can actually offer refuge from the heat. They bring the temperature down, where in suburban residential areas it rises again. And it's in the rural farmland areas that we find the lowest temperatures. This heat island effect, of course, will only get worse as global average temperatures rise. And it is something that cities will have to deal with as well. We see an increase in climate-related disasters. We see an increase in floods, in storms, droughts, and of course, extreme temperatures. And especially the extreme temperatures are happening in places where they weren't expected, or they weren't taking place in the past, which basically means that a lot of cities are just not prepared for these temperatures, have not been designed to cope with these temperatures. This is an image that we didn't see a lot of until a couple of years ago. We now see an increase in these flood events, which of course play havoc with the urban city life. And they occur more frequently than in the past. The same holds true for drought, which is at the other end of the scale, where we don't have where we have too little water. That is impacting crops and is leading to food shortages, as it impacts the total food supply chain. So the climate change is not just about water, it is also about droughts. So we need to do something about this. We need to talk about climate mitigation. And here you see a diagram from a recent paper in Nature Communications, which shows some of the strategies that are being looked at. Now, the strategy on the right-hand side of the diagram is called RFG. It's known as radiative forcing geoengineering, which is basically where we try to come up with technical solutions to kind of play down the effects that the sun's rays have on the raising of the temperatures on Earth. It's not something that I think underground space can help with. But the two other solutions are a lot more interesting, where we talk about, for example, CCU, carbon capture and use, where we see the reuse of carbon or CCS, where we have carbon capture and storage. And there's of course a combination of these where we actually capture the carbon emissions, we store them below the surface, and then we reuse them as part of the production processes. We also have CDR, which is basically carbon dioxide removal, where we either have the strategy of reducing the carbon dioxide emissions by not using fossil fuels anymore, but also by storing them again or capturing them indeed. If you look at number 7 in the diagram, you'll see these units that are actually capturing direct capture. It's called direct air CO2 capture, and then storage, which goes with the abbreviation of DACCS. Now, I'm mentioning all this because I think there are opportunities there in terms of underground space to play a role when it comes to climate mitigation. I'm also actually mentioning it because capturing carbon and storing it is now an accepted strategy. It was mentioned in the IPCC report that was published this week, but it also means that the pressure on the subsurface is increasing. The people that want to use the subsurface are not just the engineers that want to make tunnels for metro lines, but it's also other people are now looking at the subsurface and increasingly want to start using that for the storage of carbon. And we will see these developments going to happen along with the developments that we already know, where people are looking at the subsurface for energy purposes. So it's about climate mitigation. It's about trying to mitigate the effects of climate change. But there's also agreement around the world that we need to kind of look at climate adaptation at the same time. A long time we thought that we could actually, through mitigation, delay the effects of climate change. We're now realizing that although we still need to do this mitigation, the effects of climate change are already here, and they're asking for schemes where we start to adapt to the fact that the climate is changing. And these call for technological solutions, they call for social solutions, they call for nature-based solutions, but overall they call for integrated solutions. And I think this is again of interest to us when we talk about the use of the subsurface, when we talk about creating underground spaces. We need to start looking at multiple use. We need to start looking at integrated solutions as well for that. So those are the challenges that cities worldwide are facing. But we also need to look at the opportunities. What are the pathways forward, I've called them. And I think this is where we can start looking at how can we actually use the underground space. What are the pathways forward? And the first is what I would call audacity. It is we need to have the audacity to use our human ingenuity, and we need to start adapting. And this is an example of the use of underground space, which goes back to thousands of years before the Common Era, where already in China, in certain areas, the yaodongs were created. And what are yaodongs? Well, basically, they are dwellings below the surface, and these dwellings have been built by humans who were adapting to the environment, who were adapting to the climate. And they started looking below the surface for protection from the climate. And they did it in a very interesting way. They did it by basically creating these atriums. As you can see, the atriums are still open to the sky, to the outside environment, but they then lead to chambers that have been built into the rock. They go sideways into the rock to create additional spaces. And I always like to point out in this image that there are trees planted at the surface, but there are also trees planted in the courtyards that have been created. And this is a detail which we'll come back to later, which is, I think, very important. So keep the tree in mind. We'll come back to the tree later. But the point I'm trying to make here is that these kind of dwellings have been built for a long time, but they are basically the basis on which we design our underground facilities nowadays as well. And just to give you an example of that, we have the underground school extension that was built in Arnhem in the Netherlands. I won't go into too much why that was built, but basically the school needed to be extended. The original school was built by a renowned architect, and no other architect wanted to build something next to it that would compete with the original design. That was one reason. And the other one was that the whole area where it was being where they wanted to develop this is an area of outstanding natural beauty that had to be protected. So they weren't allowing any surface buildings to be developed in that area anymore. So there were two reasons to go underground. And here you can see the inside of the facility. It's a school for music and dance. The classrooms are built into the side, as it were. You can see the rooftop, which allows daylight to enter, and you can see the steel structures that have been incorporated, and they are there to withstand the soil and water pressure of the underground facility, as it's built in an area with a very high water table. And this is what it looks at the surface, how it looks at the surface. You can see that what is actually the roof when you're on the inside is at grade. It's a skylight that you can see, but most people don't notice it when they pass by. But it's an elongated yaodong. It's the same principle as the yaodongs that we saw before. And if you want to take this whole idea a little bit further, then you come to a project that was proposed by Dominique Perrault, French architect, in Seoul in South Korea. He calls it the light walk. It's basically the light walk creates at the surface a very interesting feature in this whole green area, this green public space that we find inside the city. And then below, we see that the underground space has been utilized for shops. A shopping mall has been created, but at the same time, it leads to transportation facilities. It's a transport hub. It's an underground shopping mall. It's a place where people can stay and enjoy themselves. You can see the mother and child near the water pool there, for example. We have daylight entering from the surface through the glass canopy that has been placed there. And you can actually see people walking at the surface using the light walk as you walk below. And what it does is it actually adds extra space to the city. It adds something to it's a new tissue that is being added to the existing urban tissue. But we can go further than that. We can actually also create our own caverns. The caverns is typical for humans seeking shelter. It's been something that's been done again since the advent of humans. Basically, they went for shelter inside mountains. We are now at a point where we have the technology to create spaces inside these mountains. We can excavate them. We can take out the material. That material can be reused as a building material, and we're left with a space that can be used in multiple ways. And indeed, in Singapore and also in Hong Kong, they are looking into ways of reusing these caverns. Here, for example, a wastewater treatment facility has been placed into this space. And I think what is interesting here is that you have created a space that is now being used for a wastewater treatment facility, but it could be used for any other use at the same time. This was done to free up surface space, so that at the surface we create new areas where they can develop for housing by placing the wastewater treatment facilities that up to now were at the surface, placing them below the surface. So the opportunities are unlimited in this sense. We have, as we saw an example, you can use it for education facilities. You can think about cultural facilities. Museums are obviously facilities that would have advantages when placed below the surface. If you think about it, a lot of the museums that display art or old paintings don't even want sunlight. to enter their exhibition spaces because the sunlight could actually damage the painting. So they don't even need daylight to exist. And indeed, if you look at the underground expansion of the Louvre in Paris as a good example, you'll understand what this means. At the same time, we have transport and transportation hubs. You could start combining these things. You could combine culture, education, transport hubs, shopping malls into underground facilities. Industrial facilities are possible as well. I already mentioned the wastewater treatment facilities and geo-resources. And of course, the geo-resources is where we hit on what I already looked at earlier, talked a little bit about, is the fact that we can use the subsurface for energy purposes. We can use the subsurface for storing CO2. We can use the subsurface for extracting materials. But then we have to decide on how all these uses will come together, and that is what we will be looking at in a minute. Because planning, as I said earlier, is essential. It's what I would call key principle number one. And why is this important? Well, basically, we want to avoid what I would call urban confusion. So we need urban planning to determine what uses are placed where in the subsurface. It's about locality, but also about temporality, as we will see later on. Time plays a role as well when we're using the subsurface, and we need to think about what that means when you come to determine whether or not you're going to use the subsurface over a period of the next maybe 100 years. Urban design needs to account for a balance between the public and the private domains. We need to think about accessibility, and we need to think about inclusivity. And we'll go into these things now. So when I talk about where do we place our tunnels, or where do we place our underground facilities, if we look at cities like London, if we look at cities like Paris, where they have these well-developed underground systems, and they started to think about using the subsurface for other things as well, you can see from this diagram, depicting the underground of London, that where they started with cut and cover tunnels at maybe depths of 5 to 6 meters. The Greenwich Foot Tunnel ran a bit deeper because it had to pass under the River Thames, and that went to 15 meters. We have Suez and the Whitehall tunnels at 4 and 6 meters depth. As we go through time, you can see that things are being placed deeper and deeper below the surface. The deepest station is Hampstead at 58.5 meters below the surface. But the new Crossrail, for example, is at 25 meters depth, but sometimes has to go to 42 meters to go under already existing networks. This is a diagram showing what is beneath Piccadilly Circus in London. Nobody really at the surface appreciates all the facilities, all the tunnels, all the interconnecting corridors that are actually below the surface. And again, whether you look at London or whether you look at Paris, you'll find these enormous underground labyrinths, or as a French architect coined them, he talked about the mangroves that were, as it were, below the surface. The mangroves, you can see nice greens above the surface, but the whole root structure that then extends below the surface actually determines the mangroves, and in this case all the underground roots, if you like, determine the city, because the city couldn't function without these underground facilities and underground networks. At the same time, we need to avoid creating what I would call the urban surface layer. We need to appreciate that the subsurface does not serve the city. It is not there to just place everything we don't want at the surface. We place it below the surface. The subsurface is an integral part of the city. It provides support to the city in the sense that it makes life in the city possible. So its development should aim at integrating the new tissue that we are creating below the surface into the existing urban fabric. We should stop with creating these single purpose spaces that only connect through a staircase to the surface. We need to start thinking bigger in that sense. So we need to move from creating an urban surface layer towards an underground urbanism. We need to look at an underground urbanism, and this is indeed what the ITA Committee on Underground Space is doing together with ISOCARP, the International Society of City and Regional Planners. We are looking at ways on how we can develop an underground urbanism, what this is, and how that then ties in with urban planning and urban design. This whole concept of public domain and private domain is an interesting one as well. Here you see a schematic of the Canary Wharf underground station in London, where you have two canopies appearing above the surface. You enter them, you go down into towards the ticket hall, and even further down to the two round circles that represent the two tunnels where the London Underground is going through. Essential in this is that the limits of public domain are defined by where people go into this whole underground facility and where they then come across a ticket barrier, and they need a ticket. They need to buy a ticket to go through the ticket barrier before they can use the transport system. But where you place the ticket barrier also then determines where there is still public domain and where the private domain starts. So we think of it as when we design these underground systems, we think it is pretty normal that people buy a ticket. We think it's pretty normal that we close them down when there are no more metros running through the system. But by doing so, we actually kind of separate these domains from the public domain. So they're not part of the city. They're only there at the time they can be used. And this is something we need to be very careful about when it comes to designing our underground facility. So here, the Canary Wharf station, as you go in, you go down the escalator. At the bottom of the escalator, you can't go further if you don't have a ticket. So it is a very functional part of the city, but it doesn't add in that sense to the city. Another example is the underground city in Montreal in Canada, where effectively we see that the basements of buildings have been extended and interconnected. So they've created in that way this whole private domain again beneath the city. Here the Place des Jardins in Montreal, where you have these underground shops, these underground plazas. You can relax there, you can sit there. There can be entertainment in these areas. There's a water feature. We can see people sitting down to have a meal. The point is, you can only access large parts of these systems during office hours. You can only access large parts of this system during the operational hours of the underground system. So again, they are not open to everyone. They are not open 24 hours a day. They are part of the offices above, and as such they are limited. So here you have this clash between public domain and private domain, and also in terms of who is actually responsible for those people inside that private domain. Is it the owners of the offices? Is it the owners of the hotels? Or does the city itself still have a role to play there, even if it's a private domain? So can you actually do this differently? And the answer to that is yes. Here we have an example of the Beurstraverse in Rotterdam, which is basically a sunken shopping street. It runs under the main road through the city, the Koolsingel, which is a major artery. There's also a underground metro line running beneath it. There's a station there. There are department stores there. But essentially, what has been done there is that the public domain has been continued into the underground. And how was that done? Well, that was basically by sinking, as I said, the street to the -1 level, and then opening up shopping spaces there, or connections into the department stores on either side. You could go to the metro station and you can walk down and follow the street right to the other side, passing under the major roadway. And there are some important features there. There are water features there where children can play during summer, but they can do this independently of the shop opening hours, independently of the operating hours of the metro system. So you can, at any time of day, any day of the year, you can walk along this underground street. And most importantly, I told you that we would come back to the trees. Note that the trees have been placed there. Note that the trees are there because they give people the idea that they're still walking at the surface, even though they're walking a couple of meters below the surface. So here you can see how you can actually try to integrate your development into the public domain and make it remain in the public domain. So again, key principle 1, planning is essential. Planning and design of urban underground spaces is required to prevent a self-replicating network coming into existence that is privately owned and operated, because that will always limit the use in terms of what we would really like to see inside the city. And what we really want to see inside the city is public spaces. Public spaces are as vital to underground development as they are to the city in general. So when it comes to thinking about creating underground spaces, we really need to think about how we can avoid all these spaces turning into privately owned spaces, and then also single purpose spaces. Which then brings me to key principle number 2, which is the multiple use is essential. If there's one thing that I want you to take away from my presentation, is that we need to stop wasting underground space. That might seem strange from the point of view that I'm an advocate of using underground space, but I'm also an advocate of using underground space in the right way. So we need to stop building single-use infrastructures or facilities. We need to look at how we can combine uses in such a way that space is used in a multiple way. We need to start integrating uses in such a way that waste is reused. And we need to start creating spaces that can be repurposed in multiple ways over time. And just to give you a quick example of single-use infrastructures, if we create a metro line, what does that metro line do? It only serves to move people from one station to the other, and that's all it does. And it also only does that during a certain part of the day. So part of the 24 hours of operations, it will be not doing anything, and it will just move people. At the same time, we have enormous problems with logistics in our cities. We have problems with bringing food into the city. We have problems with bringing all other kinds of things into our cities. So why is it a strange idea to look at if we can develop these metro lines in a different way, and maybe use them also as underground logistical systems when we don't need to transport people? It's interesting to see that, for example, in the aviation industry, we have planes that carry both cargo and people, and sometimes they even carry a lot of cargo and smaller people. We have specially designed planes that can actually do that. Why can't we think of that when we are looking at infrastructure? So here's another interesting example of a single purpose piece of infrastructure, the water temple in Tokyo. It's an enormous underground facility, and it has only one purpose, which is to store rainwater. if there's a lot of rainwater falling in Tokyo, which is of course a city which has a lot of paved areas where the water just runs off straight away into the sewer system, that then empties out onto the rivers. The rivers then, the river levels rise, and they can burst their banks, causing flooding. So one interesting way of dealing with this is to create these underground facilities where you can store enormous amounts of water in an attempt to actually prevent the rivers from bursting their banks. And then once the rain has subsided and the levels have receded, you can then take the water out of this storage facility again. In building this, they've created an interesting temple, but it only does one thing: it stores water. Yes, you can have people walking through it. Maybe it's interesting for tourists to visit. Maybe you can even use it for a James Bond movie or something. But at the end of the day, it only does one thing: it stores that water. The same approach that was taken in Tokyo has been taken in Rotterdam in the Netherlands as well. And there they've actually combined these two uses into one underground facility. They've created a water retention basin, but they've also created an underground car park. And these exist next to each other, so they're not flooding the car park when they need to store water. There's a water retention basin and there's a car park, but it has been built in one facility. But you can take this a step further, as was done in Kuala Lumpur with the smart tunnel, the storm water management and road tunnel. There they created one tunnel that does two things. It can take cars, but they can also take the cars out and then use it to get rid of the floodwaters that might otherwise flood the central business district of the city. So you can see how we can move from the Tokyo example, single purpose, to combining two uses in one facility, and then integrating it even further, as in the case of the smart tunnel. Another nice example of how we can integrate the use of the subsurface and above the surface is the Transbay Transit Center in San Francisco. Here again a schematic, but this is basically not only just showing how we integrate the subsurface and the surface, but it also shows you how we can actually bring sustainability into the whole operation. So if you start at the lowest level, you can see an underground a rail line running there. You have the intermediate platform level, and then as we move from the surface up into the building, you can see that where passengers can go to the bus platform, and above that we even have a new park. So there's a if you would, it's basically an elevated park on top of the facility, but that even serves a purpose because we want to capture the rainwater. We want to hold on to the rainwater and reuse that rainwater in the facility. At the same time, you see that the air can travel from the lowest levels to the highest levels, providing a natural means of ventilation. You can see the trees that have been planted there that take the CO2 out of the air, but they also provide shade and cool in a city where there's just a lot of buildings and not a lot of green spaces. So this one facility, because it has been developed as an integrated facility, not just makes use of the underground space, it creates value, it adds enormous value to the city in its presence and with its rooftop park. But then if you look at the right-hand side of the picture, you can see these vertical pipes running into the ground. They are pumps and heat exchangers. They are actually utilizing the subsurface for storing hot water, for taking out cold water, so you can cool the building during the summer, and you can use the hot water to heat it during the winter. So this is a totally sustainable development, which is utilizing the subsurface for many different uses. We can take that even further. Here you have an example of a cavern in Sweden where they've placed a data center inside the cavern. And as we all know, these data centers, they produce a lot of heat. They require cooling. And what better use if you can actually reuse the residual heat that is being produced by these data centers. In Finland, there's an example where they take water in from the sea to cool the servers, and then that water is then heated by the servers and goes straight into the district heating system, and it helps to heat houses. And this scheme was actually in 2017 already led to a couple of Swedish cities starting an open innovation competition. And they said they were looking for creative partners with innovative solutions that can be involved in a new venture to convert waste heat into urban food or other biological production. Clean residual heat emitted from a diverse range of sources, from single refrigerators to industrial sites, represents a waste of both energy and resources that is ultimately detrimental to the local and global environment. They wanted to see how can we actually reuse this heat to heat homes and offices, but also to make things grow. And that is where we can actually start taking use of the subsurface to a totally new level that we've never thought of before. We can start thinking about, can we actually create underground farms? Can we create farms beneath buildings that actually start providing food to the city where the food is needed? It doesn't need to be flown in from faraway places. It doesn't need to be taken in from rural areas, which all has a very big CO2 footprint. If you can produce greens inside the city and then deliver them straight to where they are required, that has an enormous impact on the footprint. But this example is about a 26-floor office tower in Stockholm, where they have an underground space that was once used as an archive for a newspaper, which wasn't required anymore because obviously the whole archive has been digitized, and the space was just free. It was just there. So they said, okay, what happens if we actually put in an urban farm underground, and then the heat that is used to create to grow things in that farm, that heat is then either goes straight into the building during winter, or it's stored in a storage system underground for use later on in the winter. And you can see that the farm can be hosted in that space. They don't have to pay rent for it, because they are actually reducing the heating costs of that building enormously. So those two offset each other. And at the same time, of course, the whole CO2 footprint of that building is drastically reduced. It doesn't need gas anymore to provide heating that is provided by the urban farm. Another interesting example also from Sweden is the infra tunnel. If you look at it, it just looks like any sewer that you might find inside the city being placed below the surface. But this is actually the inside of what looks like a sewer on the outside. It is what they call an infra tunnel. It is a space they create below the surface. They do it just once. Once it's there, it can then be used to place all the cables, all the pipes that a more modern urban development requires. But it's large enough to have somebody just walk through it, so they can go through it for maintenance. They can put in new cables or pipes as they are required, and it doesn't require opening up the city anymore. Once it's there, the city can plant trees on top. It can do all kinds of things, and the streets can be maintained. They don't need to be opened again for new infrastructure, because they've created this whole flexible space below the surface that can be used for a variety of purposes over time. And I think that is the way we need to move forward. We need to start thinking about these type of uses below the surface. So we want to create space below the surface, and how we fill in that space over time is something that we need to be able, we need to be flexible in. And this is, of course, something that keeps architects busy as well. This is an example from Los Angeles, where architects have been thinking about how can we actually transform parking garages of today into the housing of tomorrow. One of the developments that we are seeing is that the whole advent of autonomous cars, a different car ownership, where people are no longer buying their own cars. They just have an app on their phone and they call for a car to come to their house when they require it, and they just take it to where they want to go and then leave it there, which is a totally different system than we have now. So there's a lot of underground car parks worldwide, because storing our cars below the surface was, of course, a very good example of how we wanted to use the urban surface layer. We have a lot of these underground car parks with heights that are not ideal, that were minimized because we didn't really want to go too deep below the surface. So we optimized it for the use by cars. Repurposing, reusing those facilities is very difficult. So in modern buildings, architects are already thinking about, okay, yeah, we have to provide car parking space, but let's make it just the floor height just a little bit higher, so that if those cars are not going to be parked there anymore, we can use it for and reuse it, repurpose it for a different use. And for me, that is the way that we have to move forward. We have to think about, when we create underground spaces, we're not creating a tunnel for a metro to go through the tunnel. We are creating an underground space that has a lot of additional uses, but also its use will change over time. That structure that we create below the surface, just like as we saw with the Yao Dongs, is going to be there for a long time. It's going to be there for hundreds of years, and it's going to have different uses over time. And that is what we need to think about when we start designing these spaces. Which brings me to my concluding remarks in terms of the challenges and opportunities for underground space. I mentioned to you already, there are two key principles. The first, we require underground space planning. And again, I remind you of that image that I gave you of the city, below the city in London, where you saw all these networks running in the horizontal plane. If we talk about carbon capture, if we talk about energy uses in the subsurface, think about geothermal energy, for example, they all require wells that are running in the vertical plane. So where are these things going to meet up? How are we going to place them? I think there's a lot of cities worldwide that are extensively using their underground spaces for networks that will have a very difficult time in being able to create wells that go down 2 or 3 kilometers for geothermal energy purposes. If we don't think about these things now, then we're going to have underground chaos, and we're going to have things running into each other. That is why we need underground space planning, but we also need it because we want to add value to the city. We want to ensure that we're not just creating single purpose private domains. We want to make it part of the public domain. We want to make it part of the city, which also means we need to look at multiple and integrated uses of those spaces that we create. 3 key messages: business as usual no longer suffices. Stop doing things as you've been doing them for a long time. Start to think about how we need to start doing things differently. We need to think about climate mitigation and adaptation in our working practice, and how we can start integrating these things into our work practice. We need to mitigate and adapt, and underground space is a vital part of that process. It's my opinion that we're going to play a vital role when we talk about creating the cities of the future, where we try to mitigate climate change, we try to adapt to climate change, and we try to build resilient cities that are inclusive and that can be used by the people that live in those cities, because that was why we created cities in the first place. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. Gracias. And I open the floor to any questions you might have.
And thank you very much for your great conference and extraordinary lecture. No, you are an authority, of course. No, thanks a lot. Maybe we can continue with Francisco Schmidt and Carlos Arroyo, and then finally we have some questions for the difference for the panel. Right? You agree with my proposal?
Well, I'd rather would have taken the questions now, because it would require me to sit another 1.5 hours, where it's already in the evening here now. But
okay.
But it's okay. How long will it take?
Half an hour, more or less. No.
Okay, that's fine. Okay,
You have time.
I'll just
Yes.
yeah, I'll stay here. Yeah, don't worry.
But thanks a lot. It's so interesting, your lecture, no? And this marvelous conference. Thanks a lot. We continue with